Maglakelidze, and the title of my research project is, at the moment, is a post-Soviet state engagement with immigrant populations. It has been quite the journey reaching the puzzle that I have now, and I think it makes the most sense for me to offer you a brief synopsis of my progression throughout the semester. So I really started by researching the Soviet Stalinist policies of liquidation abroad, which then led me to briefly analyze the cultural stigma surrounding immigration and the legislative decrees that permitted agents to actually practice wet work policies abroad. And so after engaging with the scholarly literature, I found that the wet work policies were actually really forms of what is called extraterritorial repression, or repression exported across sovereign borders. Scholars argue that Russia's current policies of extraterritorial repression are kind of a sort of a continuation of Stalinist era policies, which then made me wonder about all of the other former Soviet Union republics that too experienced the Iron Curtain and the historical narrative of enmity towards immigration. So this brought me to a more general phenomenon and literature and the goals and implications of the policies by sending states towards their nationals abroad, and what factors really shape those policies. In other words, I want to study which factors are most influential in shaping these policies, so I can explain why some former Soviet republics practice high levels of extraterritorial repression while others do not, in order for my audience to better understand how traditional conceptualizations of sovereignty in the international system are being transformed. So now I turn to the literature, and it gravitates towards this one concept, really, of transnational governmentality inspired by Foucault. And so it refers to the government's efforts to reproduce citizen sovereign relationship beyond territorial borders by institutionalizing the links between migrants and home societies. And so I divide the literature in external and internal factors. So traditional internal factors include tapping, which is really the idea that rational state actors engage immigrant populations as a resource to be tapped into for material interests and gains, such as remittances. But this factor on its own neglects the debate on whether the thickening of these relationships point to new forms of democratic governance, which I would call liberal optimism, while the other side realistically or pessimistically views the engagement as long-distance ethnic nationalism, and that the more significant drivers of the state policy is the conceptualization of ethnicity, nationality, and sovereignty. Lastly, a large portion of the literature talks about and also calls for research into diffusion theories, whereby regional actors all adopt similar diaspora policies that emerge as the quote-unquote best. So in Latin America, the states in that region borrowed the Mexican model for state-diaspora relations. So these theories also helped me pick my cases. I chose 3 cases that seem similar in many ways and yet have surprisingly different outcomes. The scope of my causal arguments are limited to these former Soviet republics, including the Slavic, Central Asian, and Transcaucasian ones. I pick one case from each of these classifications, the Russian Federation, Kazakhstan, and Georgia. And so those I spatially delineate through the home state, the sending state, whatever you'd like to call it. And then I also delineate it temporally because they're bounded from the year the USSR collapsed and until 1 year from now. Ago. And so I pick these cases also because I'm able to control for the macro historical factors of the strict policies and cultural stigma against immigration. And so in her book, Brand does a comparative case study between states in the Middle East and North Africa and their policy towards citizens living abroad. And she really does emphasize the macro historical factors. Now that leads me to the variation or the different levels of types of outcomes. And so my dependent variable emerges as the intensity of state repression exported to nationals abroad. So I operationalize this by levels of intensity, high, medium, and low. This is an ordinal level of measurement that I borrow by borrowing from the 5 mechanisms outlined by Lewis. And you can see that on the left. And so I use this to kind of systematically create a sound operationalization of my dependent variable. Now I move on to my possible independent intervening variables. The state perception of immigrant population. Glacius in 2008 created this matrix to classify how both regimes currently perceive and treat their immigrant populations abroad. I also would look at the regime type. And so it seems obvious that an authoritarian regime would export repression abroad. However, this is not an automatic link. Uh, in her case comparison, Brand shows that autocracies sometimes concerned with legitimation um, are more enfranchising than they are repressing. Lastly, I also look at the institutional collaboration with Russia, so the diffusion theory, so membership to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization could be a factor. So now I move on to my methodology. And so I have to pick my logic of comparison, which has been excruciating difficult for me. So I am picking the Mills methods of difference to compare the hypothetical causal models of my combinations of causes to reach an invariant or deterministic argument. I'll focus on comparing the different outcomes in the DV, as I've mentioned before. These are my hypotheses. I will not read them out loud, but feel free to pause the video and read them for yourself. Moving on to the methodological concerns indicative of a neopositive research project. My findings should accurately capture the purported phenomenon, the export of repression across sovereign borders. For my findings to be reliable, I must be transparent about my triangulation of these sources that I use, especially because a large percent of the research deals with information that authoritarian regimes especially are not readily transparent about. And so then we have lastly, we have falsifiability. And so my hypothesis can indeed be negated, and the causal models are tentative in the fact I also feel that I don't have enough information yet to tease out the most significant factors, which brings me to a trade-off which I miss dearly from the world of interpretive research, the freedom to kind of reason abductively and allow your research to follow and accommodate the discovery of new knowledge. But I picked the interpretive research. My findings would be less applicable across the fields of study that I draw upon in my literature review, plus in small n world, I get the best of both worlds because I can still do a deeper analysis than I would be able to with a large n, but I also can do analysis of how identities are constructed discursively, as Lewis does. But also the very design of comparing cases greatly appeals to me, to my intellectual personality, or even my habits of thought, as Abbott would say. Lastly, a drawback from the small n is the less impetus to address my reflexivity and agency as a Russo-Georgian researcher. Moving forward, I have a couple of issues with my methodology that I would definitely need to iron out for my final narrative paper, but beyond that, I must read more literature and work on filling the extraterritorial gap that Glassius describes in her research. Thank you.